Hi, this is Ted, and for the next hour, you'll be listening to a reading of articles and features from the Monday, January 12th New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. We'll start with this one. Under Trump, U.S. adds fuel to a heating planet. By pulling the United States out of the main international climate treaty, seizing Venezuelan crude oil, and using government power to resuscitate the domestic coal industry while choking off clean energy, the Trump administration is not just ignoring climate change, it is likely making the problem worse. Trump has never been shy about rejecting the scientific reality of global warming. It's a hoax, he has said, a scam and a con job. In recent days, his administration has slammed the door on every possible avenue of global cooperation on the environment. At the same time, it is sending the message that it wants the world to be awash in fossil fuels sold by America, no matter the consequences. The moves follow one of the hottest years on record, during which scientists say climate change supercharged raging wildfires in Los Angeles, deadly flooding in Texas, and a Category 5 hurricane that ravaged Caribbean islands. The planet is on course to heat up more than 1.5 degrees Celsius, that's 2.7 Fahrenheit, compared with pre-industrial levels. That's the threshold beyond which scientists say the risks of catastrophic storms, droughts, wildfires, and heat waves, as well as species extinction, increase significantly. The Earth has already warmed by between 1.3 and 1.4 degrees Celsius. Under Trump, the U.S. has become the only nation to renege on a pledge to try to keep warming to 1.5 degrees. Its actions will make the global fight harder, scientists say. Emissions will be higher, warned Justin Mankin, an associate professor at Dartmouth College, who researches climate variability. Trump's greenhouse gas emissions will cause Trump's heat waves, Trump's droughts, Trump's floods, and Trump's wildfires. America's carbon dioxide emissions from burning coal, oil, and gas, which have made it the biggest polluter since the start of the industrial age, had been declining steadily since 2007. But last year, after Trump returned to the White House, emissions rose 1.9%, according to the federal government. Researchers attributed the rise to an increased use of coal, the dirtiest fossil fuel. Scientists said U.S. emissions should ultimately decline again, in large part because renewable energy remains cheaper than fossil fuels. But the decrease could be slower and smaller than a safe atmosphere requires. The science is clear that every action matters and every ton of carbon matters, said Katherine Hayhoe, a climate scientist and professor at Texas Tech. There's a price to pay for every ton of carbon we produce, and that price is being added to our global debt. On Wednesday, Trump announced that he was withdrawing the U.S. from a long list of United Nations organizations, including the treaty that underpins international cooperation on global warming and the Nobel Prize winning group made up of the world's leading climate scientists. It came days after the U.S. seized control of Venezuela's oil, the largest known supply in the world, but a particularly dirty grade, which produces more greenhouse gases when burned than American oil. And those were just the latest maneuvers. Over the past months, the administration has forced 5 domestic power plants that burn coal to continue operating despite their planned retirement. It also halted 5 offshore wind farms along the East Coast that are already partially built and were to provide clean energy to millions of homes and businesses. Those moves capped a year in which the Trump administration systematically eliminated regulations designed to reduce greenhouses and gutted federal subsidies that could have brought more wind and solar power onto the grid. With Republican allies in Congress, the administration erased incentives to help consumers switch to non-polluting electric cars from gasoline-burning vehicles. At the same time, federal agencies imposed new policies making it easier and cheaper to produce and burn oil, gas, and coal. Trump administration officials have insisted that investment in clean energy hurts the United States. When it comes to climate change, we just chuck rationality at the door, Energy Secretary Chris Wright said this week. He claimed clean sources don't produce enough energy and don't reduce emissions, calling it the greatest malinvestment in human history. Scientists disagreed. Said Michael Oppenheimer, a professor of geosciences and international affairs at Princeton, in my wildest dreams, I could not have imagined that the Trump administration would do the level of destruction they have tried to do to the development of renewable energy in this country. Why didn't I think it imaginable? Because it's not rational. Dr. Oppenheimer said the totality of Trump administration actions could lead to either a rise in U.S. emissions or a slowing of their decline. The severity of the climate consequences depends upon how long the policies stay in place. Calculating the potential impact of the Trump administration on emissions is complicated by the fact that some of the changes to policy and regulations have not yet taken place. Calculating the One study conducted by the Environmental Defense Fund, a nonprofit group, found that some of the biggest regulatory actions being taken by Trump could add 32 billion metric tons of additional climate pollution to the atmosphere by 2055, more than 4 times the country's annual emissions today. The administration seems hell-bent on blowing past ever more dangerous thresholds, said Rob Jackson, a Stanford climate scientist who chairs the Global Carbon Project, a group of scientists that tracks countries' climate emissions. He noted that China and Europe are continuing to lead the world in addressing climate change, but said he worries about the signal Trump's actions send globally. They won't continue to act on their own forever if countries like the U.S. ignore the threat of climate change, Dr. Jackson said. For the foreseeable future, the U.S. is no longer part of the global community trying to slow the Earth's warming. Johan Rockström, director of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research and a leading climate scientist, described the Trump administration's actions as the last gasp of fossil fuel interests. He argued that on a global level, the transition to clean energy was already accelerating despite Trump, driven by the economics of clean energy. In 2025, wind, solar, and other renewable power sources surpassed coal as the leading producer of electricity. We are at the beginning of the end of the fossil fuel economy, Dr. Rockström said. The U.S. is betting on the wrong horse. And while we're on bad news, Trump says civil rights led to white people being very badly treated. By Erica Green. President Trump said in an interview that he believed civil rights era protections resulted in white people being very badly treated, his strongest indication that the concept of reverse discrimination is driving his aggressive crusade against diversity policies. Speaking to the New York Times on Wednesday, Trump echoed grievances amplified by Vice President J.D. Vance and other top officials, who in recent weeks have urged white men to file federal complaints with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. When asked whether protections that began in the 1960s, spurred by the passage of the Civil Rights Act, had resulted in discrimination against white men, Trump said he believed a lot of people were very badly treated. White people were very badly treated where they did extremely well and they were not invited to go into a university to college, he said, an apparent reference to affirmative action in college admissions. So I would say in that way, I think it was unfair in certain cases. He added, I think it was also at the same time, it accomplished some very wonderful things, but it also hurt a lot of people. People that deserved to go to a college or deserved to get a job were unable to get a job. So it was a reverse discrimination. Trump's comments were a blunt distillation of his administration's racial politics, which rest on the belief that white people have become the real victims of discrimination in America. During his campaign for president, Trump harnessed a political backlash to the Black Lives Matter and other protests, saying there was, quote, a definite anti-white feeling in this country, unquote. And he joined his base in denouncing what he deemed to be woke policies. The Trump administration has claimed that eradicating policies that promote diversity would shepherd in a merit-based society. But for civil rights leaders, Trump's remarks showed that the perceived plight of white men was the true focus. Derek Johnson, president of the NAACP, the nation's oldest civil rights organization, said there was, quote, no evidence that white men were discriminated against as a result of the civil rights movement, the Civil Rights Act, and efforts to rectify the long history of this country denying access to people based on race in every measurable category. Within hours of taking office, Trump ordered the dismantling of diversity, equity, and inclusion offices that were responsible for addressing systemic discrimination against minorities and women. And last year, he ordered federal agencies to halt enforcement of core tenets of the bedrock Civil Rights Act. He has gone on to equate diversity with incompetence and inferiority, and cast himself as the protector of white people both at home and abroad. Asked on Wednesday whether his immigration agenda was aimed at making the country whiter, Trump said he wanted people who love our country. It's very simple, said Trump, who has carved out exceptions to his crackdown on refugee admissions for mostly white South Africans. I want people that love our country, he said. Carrying out Trump's agenda is the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which was formed in 1965 under the Civil Rights Act. The commission's chair, Andrea Lucas, issued a striking video message last month underlining the agency's new posture. Quote, are you a white male who has experienced discrimination at work based on your race or sex? Ms. Lucas said in the video posted on X. You may have a claim to recover money under federal civil rights laws. Contact the EEOC as soon as possible. Time limits are typically strict for filing a claim. The EEOC is committed to identifying, attacking, and eliminating all forms of race and sex discrimination, including against white male applicants and employees, she said. In the video, she pointed white men to the Commission's frequently asked questions on DEI-related discrimination, which notes that DEI is a broad term that is not defined in the Civil Rights Act. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission is the nation's primary litigator of workplace discrimination, and for decades has been a resource for minorities, women, and other groups who have historically faced discrimination. But Ms. Lucas has endeavored to make it one of Trump's most powerful tools against DEI, with a particular focus on remedying perceived harms against white men. Ms. Lucas's tweet was boosted by Stephen Miller, Trump's top domestic policy advisor, and Vance, who shared the video in a series of tweets railing against DEI last month. The vice president also shared an essay that blamed diversity initiatives for depriving white men of opportunities. A lot of people think DEI is lame diversity seminars or racial slogans at NFL games, Vance wrote last month on X. In reality, it was a deliberate program of discrimination primarily against white men. Labor and civil rights lawyers said Ms. Lucas's video was an escalation in the administration's tactics to use civil rights laws to remedy what it sees as the disenfranchisement of white men, rather than to help groups that have historically faced discrimination. I've never seen, in the history of an agency, a blanket request to only one racial group and gender to contact the chair's office directly to raise concerns about discrimination, said Jenny Yang, former chair of the commission. That raises significant concerns. And you're listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times, the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. A new article, How the MAGA Plan to Control TV Triggered a Free Speech Fight, by Jim Ruttenberg. On a Wednesday morning in mid-December, Senator Ted Cruz, chairman of the powerful Senate Commerce Committee, faced off with a potentially hostile witness, Brendan Carr, the conservative Republican who heads the Federal Communications Commission. Cruz called Carr to testify before the committee in October, days after Carr very publicly demanded that ABC suspend the late-night host Jimmy Kimmel, citing a monologue about Charlie Kirk's killer that inflamed the MAGA right. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way," Carr had said on a right-wing podcast. Disney, ABC's parent company, took Kimmel off the air for a week. In the run-up to the hearing, Fox News and CNN commentators anticipated a grilling. Divisions within Trump's movement were becoming more common, with fights breaking out over the Epstein files, Israel, and even the place of neo-Nazis in the Republican Big Tent. The FCC attack on network television had thrust free speech into the mix, with a few Republicans saying things had gone too far and others saying they needed to go further still. J.D. Vance, the expected Trump standard bearer in 2028, dismissed Carr's threats as a joke on social media. But Cruz, whose own undisguised presidential ambitions rested in part on maintaining his reputation as a free speech warrior, had said they were dangerous as hell and likened Carr to a mobster right out of Goodfellas. The Wall Street Journal's editorial page, which agreed, called it Cruz's finest hour. Still, Cruz couldn't get out too far ahead of the party. Republicans had long been united in the view that a leftist censorship industrial complex was victimizing conservatives. Free speech was a great rallying cry of President Donald Trump's comeback, and Cruz had presented himself as a First Amendment champion as far back as 2014, when, as a freshman senator, he moved to block proposed restrictions on the flow of dark money to political ads. Whoops. Cruz had followed Trump's 2025 inauguration day vow to immediately stop all government censorship with his own pledge to go after any big tech companies that suppressed speech. By the fall, though, it was hard to ignore the fact that Trump's entire second term seemed to be a grand exercise in coercive government, and in particular that the government effort to suppress free speech grew largely on the power of the government itself to speak freely. By way of interviews or proclamations or letters or even just posts on social media, the president and his agencies compelled universities to eliminate diversity initiatives and restrict campus protest and forced several major law firms to pledge political neutrality. The administration attacked network television with particular intensity. As Trump lashed out at ABC, NBC, and CBS for what he called bias, his FCC chairman clarified the real stakes, warning the networks that he could and would use his powers to block mergers or pull the licenses of broadcasters who did not operate in the public interest, which finally brought him an invitation to Cruz's hearing room. "Chairman Carr, let's start with free speech," Cruz said. Democrats and leftists, he asserted, had long sought to weaponize the FCC's public interest standard, which requires licensed broadcasters to use the public airwaves in a manner consistent with public interest, convenience, and necessity, to pressure conservative media companies. Did Carr agree that such pressure is wrong? Carr agreed. Then Cruz moved on to the reaction to Kimmel's monologue. ABC and its affiliates would have been fully within their rights to fire him or simply to no longer air his program, Cruz said. That was their choice. But what government cannot do is force private entities to take actions that the government cannot take directly. Here was the crux of the matter. Cruz was talking about jawboning, a still evolving legal term for government coercion by speech. But the line between the bully pulpit and flat-out bullying was still being drawn. Government officials threatening adverse consequences for disfavored content is an unconstitutional coercion that chills protected speech, Cruz said. This is why it was so insidious how the Biden administration jawboned social media into shutting down conservatives online over accurate information on COVID or voter fraud. Then Cruz finally addressed Carr's actions, but obliquely. Democrat or Republican, we cannot have the government arbitrating truth or opinion, he said. Mr. Chairman, my question is this. So long as there is a public interest standard, shouldn't it be understood to encompass robust First Amendment protections to ensure that the FCC cannot use it to chill speech? Carr took the both sides framing of the question as a free pass. Yes, Senator, I agree with you there, he said, and I think the examples you laid out of weaponization during the Biden years are perfect examples. Cruz didn't follow up with any questions related to Kimmel or to any other actions under Trump. Having managed to maintain his stand against weaponizing the FCC, Cruz left the tough questions about whether Carr had done any jawboning to the Democrats on the committee. Those watching online or on C-SPAN would have said that the expected grilling had come to little. One viewer, though, had a very different perspective on Cruz's implication, veiled as it was, that Carr had done something wrong. A lot of us conservatives were incredibly burned by the social media experience in the Biden years, a Wisconsin-based lawyer named Daniel Suhr told me after the hearing. But Carr was doing something different, Suhr said, something that was important and good. There's a difference between a bureaucrat reaching outside their jurisdiction to jawbone and a regulator speaking within their jurisdiction on the issue where they regulate. Given its diminished state and declining influence, network television might seem to be an odd prize in the Trump-era culture wars. But network television, which can still be received free by any home with an antenna, regularly draws a mass audience on the order of 10 million for 60 Minutes, 7 million for ABC's World News Tonight, and more than 100 million for the Super Bowl. The station's local newscasts are the only form of journalism that still rates well with members of both parties in polls on media trust. Trump, who spent more than a decade as the star of NBC's The Apprentice, registers every televised knock on him as a serious political hit. Since his earliest days running for president, he has demanded that the FCC punish the networks for any perceived mistreatment by stripping them of their licenses. Few took the demands seriously, in part because they were based on an erroneous premise. The FCC does not, in fact, license ABC, CBS, NBC, or Fox. It licenses the hundreds of affiliated local television stations that broadcast their content over the public airwaves, some of which are independently operated and some of which are owned by the networks themselves. Still, when Trump called once again for the FCC to pull the license of a network after his September 2024 ABC debate with Kamala Harris, which he deemed rigged, Suhr took note. He and his colleagues at the Center for American Rights, based in Chicago, had been thinking about how the government could discipline the networks for what they saw as anti-Trump bias. And they had seen that the obvious pressure point would be the local stations that broadcast their programming. For nearly a century, the federal government has managed traffic over the public airwaves with exclusive licenses to specific bands of the radio and television spectrum, which it declared a public resource. The right to use that public spectrum came with a statutory obligation to serve the public interest, largely by providing educational and news programming that was politically balanced. On his first day back in office, Trump appointed Carr, one of the FCC's commissioners since 2017, to the top job. 2 days later, Carr reinstated 3 of Suhr's complaints. Not the petition against Fox, though. He agreed with the now departed Biden FCC chair that the argument was not compelling and thought it should have been dismissed even sooner. The template was now set for Carr to give Trump what he had always wanted: muscle behind his previously hollow threats to punish the networks. In an interview in November, Carr gave the president of the Center for American Rights credit for lighting the way. Daniel Suhr has been very helpful in pointing out not just the issue, but providing sort of the legal and regulatory framework to move forward on it, he told me. Enforcing the public interest standard, he said, was his duty as the FCC chair. Carr ran with Suhr's approach. In February, he sent the letter to KCBS Radio in San Francisco asking it to prove to him that it hadn't violated the terms of its license when its reporters revealed the live locations and vehicle descriptions of federal undercover immigration raids then underway in San Jose. The Associated Press reported that KCBS's journalists were subsequently dissuaded from pursuing political or controversial topics, a claim the station denied. Carr aimed even higher with Suhr's revived CBS complaint. When Trump announced his appointment, Carr declared that Suhr's complaint was likely to be a factor in the FCC's decision on the proposed sale of CBS and its parent company, Paramount, to a smaller rival, Skydance Media. Because the deal included CBS's 28 licensed stations, Carr now had final say. Paramount's controlling shareholder, Shari Redstone, was desperate to close the deal and sought to allay the administration. 11 days after Trump took office, CBS agreed to comply with an FCC request for all unedited transcripts and camera feeds from the Harris interview. No evidence of deceptive editing emerged, but Carr decided to keep the case alive regardless. That kept the heat on Redstone, who prompted CBS News bosses to place extra security on politically sensitive segments on 60 Minutes. The show's executive producer, Bill Owens, quit in protest. In July, the fruits of these efforts were revealed in the final terms the FCC set for approval of the deal. Skydance confirmed that Paramount had ceased all DEI programs as consistent with the law and public interest and would not try to revive them. It also agreed to install an ombudsman who will receive and evaluate any complaints of bias or other concerns involving CBS for a period of at least 2 years. This represented an unusual set of government demands on a national broadcast network, but Skydance didn't blanch. Predominantly a movie studio, it was controlled by David Ellison, who had never owned a news network and offered no obvious commitment to editorial independence. And he was financing the deal with help from a friend of Trump's, his father, the Oracle co-founder Larry Ellison. With the deal deadline looming, Redstone hastily removed the final stumbling blocks, agreeing to pay $16 million to settle Trump's lawsuit. 2 weeks later, CBS announced the cancellation of Stephen Colbert's late-night show, a regular target of Trump's fury. CBS executives said the cancellation was not related in any way to the show's performance, content, or other matters happening at Paramount. The following week, Carr and the 2 other sitting members of the commission held the vote. Carr and his fellow Republicans on the commission, Olivia Trustee, voted for it. The sole Democrat, Anna Gomez, voted against. Carr was clear about how he saw the stakes. President Trump is fundamentally reshaping the media landscape, he said. And how about something positive? How Mississippi transformed its schools from worst to best, by Sarah Mervush. In Kim Luckett Langston's first year as principal of Hazelhurst Elementary School, one of the lowest performing schools in what had been one of the lowest performing states, she quickly diagnosed the problem. Children at her school outside Jackson, Mississippi, were suffering from what she called ABT, ain't been taught. Kindergartners arrived not knowing their letters from their numbers. After a few years in school, they were still far behind. A decade ago, just 12% of Hazelhurst students were reading on grade level. Today, Hazelhurst has clawed that figure to 35%, and Mississippi has emerged as one of the best places in the country for a poor child to get an education. Mississippi has gone from 49th in the country on national tests in 2013 to a top 10 state for 4th graders learning to read, even as test scores have fallen almost everywhere else. Poverty remains a driving factor in student achievement, and wealthy states like Massachusetts still have the highest share of students proficient in math and reading. But adjusted for poverty and other student demographics, Mississippi is number 1 for 4th grade reading and math, and at or near the top in 8th grade, according to the Urban Institute, a left-leaning think tank. And you're listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. If you want to ask the question, which states are helping kids coming from difficult circumstances learn as much as they can, Mississippi is now doing much better than many other states, including wealthier states in affluent progressive areas, said Michael Petrilli, president of the Thomas Fordham Institute, a center-right think tank. Mississippi's gains have been confined mostly to the early years where the state has focused its efforts. The system revolves around standardized testing, and the gains have not always persisted. By raw scores, Mississippi eighth graders still rank 41st on national tests for reading and 35th for math. But Mississippi has figured out something almost no other state has, and it has involved far more than just changing the way reading is taught, the most common explanation for its success. Even as schools elsewhere have focused on issues like school funding, social justice, and mental health in recent years, Mississippi schools like Hazelhurst have made academics their North Star. At the end of the day, our job is teaching. Their job is learning, said Ms. Langston, who added that no matter what is going on in a child's life, the classroom is the one thing she can control. If we don't meet that need, we have failed them. Mississippi's progress has made it the envy of the education world, inspiring countless think pieces and recurring debates about whether the Mississippi miracle could be real. How could Mississippi, with its low education spending and high child poverty, pull it off? It did not do so by relying on some of the most common proposals held up as solutions in education, like reducing class sizes or dramatically boosting per-student funding. Rather, the state pushed through a vast list of other changes from the top down, including changing the way reading is taught in an approach known as the science of reading, but also embracing contentious school accountability policies that other states have backed away from. Science of reading is really important. It was a key piece of what we did, said Rachel Cantor, the longtime leader of Mississippi First, an education reform group, who now works at the Progressive Policy Institute, a center-left Washington think tank. But people are missing the forest for the trees if they only look at that. In addition to the reading overhaul, Mississippi raised academic standards and started giving each school a letter grade from A to F. But unlike No Child Left Behind, the Bush-era federal law that set a goal of having every child in America be proficient in reading and math, Mississippi also measures how much students progress toward proficiency. Schools get credit if students show improvement, and double credit for the improvement of students in the bottom 25%. The state also takes an unusually strong role in telling schools what to do. The Mississippi Department of Education sends literacy and math coaches into low-performing elementary schools with the goal of teaching teachers, not children. And state officials vet and approve curriculum used by the vast majority of districts, unusual in a country that prizes local controls for schools. Mississippi also made other changes, like investing in pre-K and holding back third graders who cannot read well, one of its most debated policies. The state was able to muscle through some changes, in part because it has weak teachers' unions, which have traditionally resisted accountability linked to standardized testing. The state is actually pushing more of its districts to get that progress, said Marguerite Rosa, director of the Economics Lab at Georgetown University, an education policy research group, whereas in other states it is left to chance. At Hazelhurst Elementary, the walls of Ms. Langston's office are covered in flashcards, green for students who are proficient, pink for those who are behind. There is still too much pink, a reality in a place where many children arrive at school with few academic advantages. In Hazelhurst, a rural area 35 miles south of Jackson, more than half of the children live in poverty and 2 in 3 adults don't have a college degree. A chicken plant and the local Walmart are two main employers. The elementary school serves about 625 students, mostly Black or Hispanic. All are eligible for free or reduced price lunch. It's the kind of school that might have been punished and labeled as failing during No Child Left Behind. Today, It is flooded with support. Hazelhurst's literacy coach, Summerall Newman, is at the school several times a week planning lessons, co-teaching, and offering teachers feedback. Lexi Erickson, a first-year teacher, said that instead of wrestling with the problem alone, she can simply ask, "What would you do?" State training has helped Hazelhurst confront one of its biggest challenges, teacher inexperience. It's not easy to recruit to a rural area where even experienced teachers make less than $60,000 a year. One year, the district asked all teachers to take the state test that their students would be expected to take. Woo, only 4 scored proficient or above. In the past, teachers had also been left to cobble together their own lessons or relied on curricula that lacked rigor, a national problem especially in low-income schools. Kindergartners, for example, could go through their whole year without learning all of their letter sounds. Now all teachers use the same curriculum, My View Literacy by the publisher Savas, one of several options recommended by the state. This change helps keep students on pace. So does a firm schedule. Up to 2 hours is dedicated to reading each day, along with 30 minutes of catch-up time. The work has been painstaking and a bit like whack-a-mole. Hazelhurst struggles with students with disabilities, for example, but on her walls, over the last decade, Ms. Langston has watched more students inch closer to green. If we can do it, she said, anyone can. For as much progress as Mississippi has made, it may only be staving off national trends. Last year at Hazelhurst and statewide, scores dipped for the first time outside the pandemic. We have searched high and low to figure out what the cause is. We really don't know, said Wendy Clemens, Mississippi's chief academic officer. Schools everywhere are wrestling with problems like student absenteeism and fragmented attention in the age of technology. Mississippi is doubling down on its approach. This year, the Education Department is asking state lawmakers for $9 million to expand literacy coaching beyond the early elementary grades. The state is also raising the bar for what it will take to become an A school. Other states have gone in the opposite direction, backing off of accountability and lowering proficiency standards, sometimes in the name of equity. But a handful, including Louisiana and Alabama, are seeing promising results using a similar set of strategies as Mississippi. At Hazelhurst, children spend nearly all day focused on reading, math, or science. Even music class includes vocabulary words like falsetto. Students take tests every 2 weeks. There's also joy and satisfaction in the learning itself. Preschoolers sort letters into cans of alphabet soup. First and second graders clap, stomp, and tap out syllables. Disappointment, blamelessness. Students track their own testing data. I like it, said a 10-year-old boy named Johnny. If I make a bad grade but I'm going up, it's like a staircase. The stakes are especially high in third grade because students who don't pass the state tests at the end of the year are held back, with certain exceptions. There's little evidence that retention artificially inflates scores, as some have suggested. About 6 to 9% of Mississippi third graders are held back each year, and students still take the test the following year. But the policy can be unpopular because of its emotional impact. One boy, now 11 and in fifth grade, winced, recalling the exam that would determine if he could move on. That was hard, he said. Mississippi leaders point to the academic upside. Some research suggests retention can help in the short to medium term, with at least some of the benefit coming from the extra support children receive before ever being held back. At Hazelhurst, students are screened from an early age and parents are notified if a child is behind. Struggling third graders get extra help after school. On test day, parents line the hallways with pom-poms, cheering test takers on. Ms. Langston wishes children could wait until they were a bit older to take such a high-stakes exam, but she's unapologetic about squeezing. but she's unapologetic about squeezing all she can out of the school day. While more affluent families may desire less structure and more free play at school, she said that's not a luxury her school can afford, nor is it what she believes her students need most to succeed. We are a school, she said. Students are here to learn. There are a number of good editorials, but as you know, I like to read David French. This one is called Trump and Vance Are Fanning the Flames Again. President Trump is putting on a clinic about how to break the United States. There are few things in American life more divisive than controversies over police violence. The racial reckoning of 2020 and the protests and riots that followed George Floyd's murder at the hands of a police officer are still fresh in our minds. We also remember the unrest and violence that followed the police shooting of Michael Brown Jr. in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014. The last time a president invoked the Insurrection Act and deployed active duty troops to American streets was at the request of the mayor of Los Angeles and governor of California in 1992 during the Los Angeles riots that followed the acquittal of 4 officers on charges including assault and the use of excessive force after their severe beating, crucially videotaped, of Rodney King. The King case was a preview of our modern dilemma. How do political leaders respond when video evidence causes the public to make up its own mind, regardless of what any judge or jury might have to say? The terrible divisiveness of police violence is why responsible leaders have responded to every incident with extreme care. You lament the lives lost, you promise a fair and thorough investigation, and you call for calm. You do not prejudge the case. You do not set up an expectation that justice will be done only if your side's interests are vindicated. And you definitely don't send allies and subordinates to whip up public anger. Even if you follow that playbook perfectly, you say the right words, you do the right things, violence can still erupt. That's how fraught the issue is. But Trump isn't a responsible leader, and he's at his absolute worst in a crisis. He lies, he inflames his base, and most dangerous of all, he pits the federal government against states and cities, treating them not as partners in constitutional governance, but as hostile inferiors who must be brought to heel. That's exactly what has happened in the hours and days since an ICE agent shot and killed Renee Good on the streets of Minneapolis on Wednesday. Instantly, the administration's narrative locked in. In a Truth Social post published mere hours after Good's death, Trump said that Good violently, willfully, and viciously ran over the ICE officer who seems to have shot her in self-defense. He said that it was hard to believe that the ICE agent, who was recorded walking around after the incident, apparently unharmed, was alive. Statements from senior administration officials were even worse. Kristi Noem, the Secretary of Homeland Security, said that Good committed an act of domestic terrorism. Tricia McLaughlin, the Assistant Secretary for Public Affairs at the Department of Homeland Security, referred to Good as a violent rioter and said she weaponized her vehicle attempting to run over our law enforcement officers in an attempt to kill them, an act of domestic terrorism. Not to be outdone, Vice President J.D. Vance called the incident classic terrorism. But if you watch videos of the shooting, one thing is clear. No fair-minded person could watch that incident and conclude that Good was a domestic terrorist on a mission to run down ICE agents. The administration's claims of terrorism are false, absurdly so. Good's SUV was blocking part of a road, and she appeared to signal for other traffic to go around her when an ICE vehicle approached. Multiple agents approached her car. One said, "Get out of the car," using an expletive. An eyewitness, however, said that she heard conflicting instructions, one agent telling Good to get out of the car, while another agent told her to drive away. As one of the agents places his hand on Good's door handle, she backs up slightly, turns her wheel away from the police in a direction to leave, and starts driving forward. At that moment, an agent who had positioned himself in front of her vehicle sidesteps around the vehicle and fires what sounds like 3 quick shots at Good. What Good was doing hardly qualifies as domestic terrorism, and this becomes especially clear when you compare the videos from Minneapolis with video of actual terror attacks. Classic terrorism, to use the vice president's phrase. Many of us have seen footage, for example, of the horrific ramming attack in Nice, France, in 2016 that killed 86 people, or of the domestic terror attack in Charlottesville, Virginia the following year, where a white supremacist drove directly into a crowd of Unite the Right counter protesters, killing a woman and injuring dozens of others. In both cases, the murderous intentions of the men driving the vehicles, deploying them as weapons, were unmistakable. Their goal was to inflict pain and death on as many people as possible. And you're listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times of the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. The Minnesota videos show that it was never necessary for the officer to open fire. If a first shot is taken only after an officer is out of the path of the vehicle, that shot is not necessary to save a life. In fact, dodging a vehicle rather than attempting to stop it with gunfire is the preferred course of action for federal law enforcement. Bullets, after all, do not stop cars. They kill drivers and render the car rudderless, not immobile, which is exactly what happened here. Still, the fact that a shooting is unnecessary or immoral does not mean it is criminal. A shooting can be unnecessary and immoral without being illegal, and the legal standard can be quite complex. Last May, in an analogous case called Barnes v. Felix, the Supreme Court ruled that evaluations of police shootings must consider the totality of the circumstances of a shooting, not simply the precise moment of the perceived threat. The Barnes case involved an officer who jumped onto a moving car after it fled from a traffic stop. With his life in mortal danger, the officer shot and killed the driver. The question in that case was whether courts should evaluate the shooting only on the basis of the seconds that the officer was in danger, or whether the courts should take a broader view and ask, as Justice Elena Kagan wrote for a unanimous court, about all the relevant circumstances, including facts and events leading up to the climactic moment. That means a frame-by-frame analysis of a shooting doesn't come close to resolving its legality. Even video that appears to have been taken from the shooter's angle, which emerged Friday, doesn't resolve this particular controversy. It shows Good smiling at the agent and telling him that she's not mad at him. It shows her moving her car toward him as someone, possibly her wife, tells her to drive. And it also shows the shooter sidestepping the car even as he opens fire. But we don't yet have video from the other agents. We don't know why the agent moved in front of the vehicle rather than staying to the side as the other agents did. We don't know the training the agent received. We simply cannot and should not prejudge the agent's case, if it even becomes a case. But that brings us back to this administration's malice and recklessness. There is zero indication that it intends to conduct a rigorous investigation. All of its public energy is directed toward demonizing Good and defending the agent. Even worse, the federal government has been taking steps to impede the state of Minnesota's investigation of the shooting. It can be difficult for a state government to prosecute a federal agent who commits a crime while on duty, but it's not impossible. At the very least, there is a strong state interest in investigating the incident to provide the public with a thorough, accurate, and complete account of Good's death. It's important to understand that the shooting in Minnesota is exceptional only because Good died, not because the administration lied. In fact, for the Trump administration, lying is the norm. In November, for example, a U.S. District Court, a court judge, Sarah Ellis, issued a comprehensive 233-page opinion that expressed a series of that exposed a series of administration falsehoods about ICE operations in Chicago. Time and again, she exposed discrepancies between administration accounts of riots and video evidence. She accused Gregory Bovino, the commander of the U.S. Border Patrol, of outright lying in his deposition testimony. In many ways, the Trump administration is reversing the injustice of the civil rights era. Then it was the states who violated the Constitution, and federal power offered a solution. Now the federal government is trampling the Constitution, and many states are attempting to resist. But they face a decisive disadvantage. Under our constitutional structure of government, the federal sovereign is supreme. That means federal power can offer a solution to state injustice, but there is no easy state solution for federal oppression. A president hell bent on oppression, reinforced by his pardon power, and effectively immune from conviction even if he is impeached, will be able to get his way, at least for a time. This produces the kind of tension that can break a nation. When a government oppresses its citizens and cuts off access to justice, it places an unbearable strain on the system. On Wednesday, J.D. Vance posted on X, "You can accept that this woman's death is a tragedy while acknowledging it's a tragedy of her own making." But it was not a tragedy of Good's own making. She didn't shoot herself, and the ICE agent didn't have to shoot her to save himself. The fact that a woman does not comply with police commands, especially when she may have been hearing conflicting instructions, doesn't mean that her life is forfeit. Matt Walsh, the popular right-wing podcaster, wrote, "This lesbian agitator gave her life to protect 68 IQ Somali scammers who couldn't give less of a shit about her. The most disgraceful and humiliating end a person could possibly meet." That's how much parts of MAGA devalue human life. That's how much they despise their political opponents. We should certainly respect law enforcement officers, but we are not their subjects. We are not Trump's subjects either. But that's not the president's mindset, and that's not what parts of MAGA believe. To the worst parts of MAGA, including people who exert immense power over American life, your worth is defined by your obedience. And those who don't obey, well, they deserve to die, and no one should mourn their death.